Good afternoon, everybody. So the next talk we've got is Stephen Ellis presenting Dwarf Axes from Stone Age to Silicon. Please welcome Stephen.
Thanks, Suz. Now, if any of you, and I know a number of you have seen me present before, you're probably surprised I'm not wearing my usual attire, Red Hat shirt. This is probably the most non-Red Hat talk I've ever given at an event in this region, so I'm not sure if I'm going to be employed tomorrow. This could get a little bit weird, so just bear with me. But anyway, Dwarf Axes. A bit of an overview. We're going to a brief agenda. You know, we should start with the why. So why Dwarf Axes? Why is that the concept we're using? And a little bit of IT history. And then really it's kind of what the hell is Steve actually here to talk about? It's going to go a little bit odd occasionally. And what really is a Dwarf Axe? What do I mean by a Dwarf Axe? And where are they still being used? And you'll be surprised where they're being used, potentially in your house. And then are there alternatives? Are there different approaches? How should we be looking at this going forward? Because Dwarf Axe today is probably not the right solution to the problem. We may not actually quantify what the problem is, but we may be clear on whether or not it's the right solution. And some takeaways. This is kind of where we hope to get to by the end. Dwarf Axes will still be with us for a long time. They come in many sizes, shapes and forms, but please try to stop creating them. They're not a good thing, usually. And cloud, it's just someone else's Dwarf Axe, if you're not careful. But I'm going to open up, if my slides work correctly, with a few questions for the group. Do any of you own a Dwarf Axe? Show of hands. It's all right, we'll come back to these later. Have any of you built a Dwarf Axe? Do any of you maintain Dwarf Axes? Now think about this, because I think your answer is going to be very different at the end of the session. So, why on earth are we here to talk about Dwarf Axes? And it's not just because I get to use some really cool images I find online. We have, in the last few years, had this obsession with pets and cattle when we talk about the changes in the way we build and deploy applications and workloads, pets are the things we really, really deeply care about, versus cattle are, supposedly disposable, which horrifies some people, particularly the vegans in the audience. But that's something that that came out kind of the DevOps ecosystem. An alternative that I've used a few times, and I use this at the LCA 2022 virtual event, is snowflakes versus Dwarf Axes. You see, a snowflake, there's lots of them, but they're often very fragile, but they're also kind of disposable. Whereas Dwarf Axes are strong, robust, they last the test of time. That you can kind of consider your big IT systems as Dwarf Axes. And we have many examples of big, robust systems when we look through the IT of computing. We could go back to something literally built using an axe. Hello, Stonehenge, one of the earliest forms of some kind of computational device. I love this shot. If you ever have the chance to visit the Science Museum in London, this is beautiful. But this is hardcore computing at its best. It's a piece of strong, robust technology. Well, maybe not as robust as it could have been, because it was very difficult to make back then. It was never fully completed because the cogs were too fragile. But I'd still kind of consider this a Dwarf Axe, and when we unpack the concept, maybe it'll make sense. You've got what was initially acknowledged as the first real major computer, things like ENIAC, or in the UK, you've got things like the Turing machines and the hardware that was developed at Bletchley Park. These are examples of big, robust compute systems. In more modern IT, we talk about, we still have mainframe systems. This is quite an old one, an S360. But as we mentioned, even in the keynote today, we've got mainframes are still in wide use. Oh no, it's one of the other sessions, sorry, I was in earlier. Mainframes are still in wide use in the industry. They're big, fat compute systems. Then things started to get into that kind of mid-range space. We had systems like AS400s and others. The systems that started to be adopted by smaller organizations and businesses. But these are still big iron, big tin, big axes to be used by organizations. Even when we start talking about Unix, Unix was just a different axe to be used by organizations. It was just another platform to deliver those business services. And some of those could be very big. if you've ever been in a situation where an organization is using something like a Superdome, these things are fairly huge. In fact, one organization I worked with more than 15 years ago was just getting a Superdome installed. So they had to upgrade all of the air conditioning for the data center for one rack of Superdome, just one. And it was hilarious because when it first went in, it was underpopulated. We almost had icicles hanging off the ceiling because they cooled the data center so low because they'd assumed this was going in fully populated. So just be careful how you manage your data center, heating and cooling requirements. But there are other examples of, computing that you may not expect, like the wonderful loom at the Wool Museum in Geelong. This is a shot I took when I was lucky to be there for LinuxConf AU in 2016. It runs off punch cards. The input is the wool. The output is the spun rug or blanket or whatever else it's been programmed to do. It's still effectively a giant computer in some form. So all of these things, in my view, are effectively dwarf axes. And in fact, this can potentially be a dwarf axe. It says they come in all shapes and sizes. We have a tendency to treat other devices, personal devices, family devices, in the same way. In fact, dwarf axes exist not just in large-scale enterprise IT, but in small to medium business and in the home. So what the hell is he talking about? Why a dwarf axe? And this is the funniest bit for me is I actually got the quote wrong because it's a family axe. It's a Terry Pratchett quote. In Terry's books, he often talks, we see dwarfs a lot, so I just made the association. But the most simple form is a dwarf axe is something that's been in your family for generations. It's been handed down. It's had 7 new heads and 8 new arms. It's been repaired and cared for, but it's still the same family axe. And we have a tendency to take that approach with IT systems if we're not careful. The head could be the operating system and the software we're running. It's there to deliver that service that the organization needs, whereas the handle or the haft is the hardware or the infrastructure we're operating. And I love this model because when I walk into an organization that's trying to deal with this big, large-scale IT problem that's driving everyone crazy, I can decompose it down to you've got a broken axe and you're treating it like a dwarf axe, and we can't move forward unless you change the way you're looking at it. And sometimes the organization gets it, sometimes they don't, but it makes me feel better about the problem, okay? And that's important. And if that doesn't work, you go to the Muppet Wiki and you start looking up people in the Muppet Wiki who look like the people in the meetings, because that also helps mentally. But anyway, I digress. Back to dwarf axes. Ultimately, in IT, you don't want a rusty axe. A rusty axe is a problem. If your head is rusty, you've got performance problems, you've got security risks. A blunt axe is unable to deliver the outcome your organization needs. It's no longer delivering that business service. It no longer performs well. A splintered or damaged heft or handle is a huge problem. Unstable hardware, system downtime. That axe could break while you're using it. You don't want that. So there's critical parts about maintaining the axe. We want to sharpen the head, we want to look after it. We patch the operating system regularly. We perform updates to the core application, but it's still the same axe. Same with the hardware. Over time, these big fat systems, we go in when we, in the big mid-range and mainframe systems, we literally swap CPU trays and we, upgrade the hardware over time, but it's still up, alive, operating, delivering that business service. So as long as the axe consistently delivers the service, and while we're maintaining it with this level of attention, in my view, it's a dwarf axe. And I have dwarf axes in my house. I have one in particular to use as an example. For any of you who've known me for some time, about 15 or so more years ago, I got involved quite heavily with the Myth TV project. And as part of that, I built an initial prototype using, believe it or not, I still use this case for prototyping in, although it's been through many iterations. I used, at the time, not Myth as the base. That was my software. It was a very old version of Myth TV. The hardware was a fairly kind of common commodity set of hardware that was fairly robust. And that was the starting point. And the first recording I have logged in the database was February 4th, 2006. And over time, I iterated. I finally reached version 1.0. I have a nice case now. I've now got some decent tuners. I'm just iterating. I'm just tweaking, but it's still the same axe. I now do perform some upgrades. I change some tuners. It's still the same axe. Even a change of case and a change of motherboard, it's still running the same set of software. It's just a minor software upgrade. It's still the same axe. I continue over time iterating or patching the operating system, patching the version of Myth TV, tweaking the hardware, swapping tuners as they come and go. But it's still the same platform. I'm treating it like a pet, but I don't consider it a pet. I consider it my family axe. It's still there recording TV, doing what I want. Eventually, you kind of start hitting a limit. You've got to think, well, you know, is this good enough? The axe is starting to wear out. I go through a major upgrade. This was the crazy one. I literally changed from 32-bit to 64-bit OS. So I did a complete rip and replace the operating system, but it's still delivering the same service. It still has my data. It still is my environment. It still is my axe. As far as the family's concerned, nothing changed. They go to the television, they turn it on, it's still there. It's still the same axe. But now we're starting to hit problems. I've just done a major upgrade on the head, but the handle is starting to really show signs of wear. So it's time for a change. So new motherboard, new RAM, new CPU. But the software, it's just a minor update. It's still the same axe. Still the same axe. And today, it's still the same axe. Today, the oldest recording I still have on that piece of hardware is actually from March 2006. It's done 23,000 plus episodes of television during that time. It is the same environment. It still has the same data. It's still delivering the same workload. How many of you deal with businesses and organizations that still think that way with their core IT and that still have, IT environments that they treat like this, that are still being maintained for 10, 15, 20, 25 years? Because it happens. It's still out there. And the question is where? Where are we still seeing this in IT? The fact is we're seeing it everywhere. And I mean everywhere. And in fact, many of us in the room are part of the problem because we do it at home. We have hand-me-down hardware that goes around the family. I'm finished with this. What I'll do is I'll wipe the hard drive or I'll change it and I'll put a bit of fresh RAM in and then I'll hand it off to a family member. One of the worst ones that's happening right now is very much around the phone ecosystem. Phones constantly being passed around the family, passed down and down, to the point where they're no longer getting any patches from the vendors. They're no longer getting security fixes. You're actually putting your family members at risk using those devices. So we're actually part of the problem. How many of you were around to experience the fun of Y2K from an IT perspective? And many people still say to me, but it was a non-thing. And one of the other favourite stories I had is, well, the world watched and waited to see what happened in New Zealand, which is where I'm based. Well, that was a bit bloody useless. What you should have done is wait about 11 hours later, because what you're concerned about is actually UTC, not New Zealand time. If you're running a computer in New Zealand, there's a very good chance the BIOS is running UTC. So you really need to care about Y2K in London, not Y2K in New Zealand. And a few people got tripped up by that. But it was amazing the hardware we hit, that these core critical systems that small organizations relied on, they couldn't let go and couldn't move away from. So we had, BIOS wouldn't roll over, lack of OS support. Sometimes the packages didn't support 4-digit date. And in fact, I was talking to someone last night over a drink and said, it's amazing how many organizations where the fix was just to put in a moving time window. We put in a moving time window, so we still have 2-digit date, but we assume that no one's ever 100 years old. And then it crashes because you're working for an insurance company and one of your customers is 100 years old, and the whole system goes down. And I know an organization where that happened. So what they did is they changed the moving window because they never insure anyone under the age of 5. So if anyone now hits the age of 105, they hit the problem again. And last year, one of their customers hit the age of 105 and the system went down again. So be careful how you fix these problems. But, the business data was critical. So we had to go through hardware swaps. Sometimes we had software updates, OS updates, BIOS updates. We looked at different ways to try and mitigate this. But as long as the business continued to have the service they wanted as far as they were concerned, it was the same platform. But we still hit this in the SME, SMB space today. There's an amazing amount of legacy accounting, payroll, stock management platforms in use in smaller organizations. And you might say, well, they're all gone to cloud. Well, cloud's a separate problem, but for many of them, they're still reliant on these systems on premises. There's still a huge amount of legacy Windows out there in those ecosystems. There's a couple of links here to a few reports, but the current Windows 7 market share is estimated to still be around 3.4% globally. That's a lot of systems that organizations can't change because they're too reliant on that ancient, aging axe where the head now is very rusty, where the security risks are huge, and they don't have an option, they don't know where to go. And then we get into the enterprise, where we end up having these massive workloads sometimes. I've literally been into organizations where they said they're replacing a system that they've relied on for the last 25 years. The new platform has to last longer. Not that they want to be agile or drive innovation. They're literally looking at something and saying 25 years wasn't long enough. What can we put in place that will last longer? Because they've got used to having these long-lived platforms. I'm also seeing organizations where they're heavily reliant on virtualization to provide a virtual axe for them to operate on. And now they're so reliant on it, they've built in these anti-patterns that really can't be supported going forward. They're trying to make systems last long past their expected lifetime. And that's starting to hurt those organizations. But we see this with big proprietary code bases. We see this with big legacy platforms. We see it across a range of the industry. Some businesses are innovating and modernizing. Others are still stuck there saying, what does my new axe look like? Or how can I repair the current axe I'm running? So, there's nothing wrong with a big axe. Most of you won't get this. This is a TUI advert. TUI's a beer brand in New Zealand. They have this billboard thing. Yeah, right. Nothing wrong with a big axe. Well, big axes also kind of promote big axe style projects, the projects that are too big to fail. An air traffic control system that fails because we didn't put enough memory in the box. Like, really? We've had big ERP programs go down. We've got the INSYS project in New Zealand, which is a big IT project failure, happened around the time I first moved there in the early 2000s. It was a huge failure. Here in Australia, you've had Queensland Health and Mikey, big projects that were too big to fail, and yet everything went off the rails. But what I love was a major insurance company was going through a big platform refresh. They were literally trying to get off one of these big axes. They were trying to move everything off this giant traditional back-end system. It took them 2 years just to get the requirements right before they even wrote a line of code. They hard defined the software platform and hardware platform they were going to deploy this on. They sent the developers away. And when they delivered the first prototype, the software they were going to run for their middleware was already end-of-lifed. It was no longer supported. The project requirement that was when this was implemented, it had to go live without any patches, fixes, or maintenance for a minimum of 7 years. Because they were stuck in this big axe mindset. And that's still a common problem. How can we change this? How can we be more agile? And then big axes can break in really, really interesting ways. So, this is another favorite of mine. A twin chassis Sun server was being delivered. and it has an interconnect because it's two planes. So ultimately, it looks like one set of CPUs. It looks like one hardware platform. Those of you who are reading ahead are probably kind of, you what? But yeah, we turn it on. We can only see one set of CPU and RAM. And so someone went and checked the security cam footage. In fact, this is kind of in the wrong area because the first thing we did was went to the data center, tried to have a look at the hardware, and we couldn't get it out the rack. So someone checked the security cam footage and found it was installed using a sledgehammer. And in fact, it took two of us with a crowbar to remove the system from the rack. And when we did get it out, we found the chassis was completely buckled. And it wasn't buckled because of the sledgehammer. It was buckled because when they delivered it, they dropped it off the truck. And it landed on the corner, and the entire chassis buckled, so the whole thing wouldn't hold together. But someone thought it was a really good idea to still get it in the rack. In order to do that, they literally walked up to the rack with a sledgehammer to get the damn thing in. Sledgehammers and servers don't mix, but big axes, when they break in really, really interesting ways. So, yeah. It's not often you see people wandering around a data center with a crowbar. But what are the alternatives? Are there alternatives? Can we look at delivering these solutions for our customers, for ourselves in different ways? So I mentioned it earlier, what about virtual machines? Well, your virtual machines are just kind of like small axes in a way. You know, we compare and contrast virtual machines and containers today, but there's that little bit of infrastructure, there's that little bit of virtual hardware it needs to be aware of. So I've put the diagram here to show just a little bit more than the head. There's a little bit of heft there involved, but ultimately your virtual machine is running on an axe somewhere. It's running on a big piece of metal. Some of those virtual machine hosts can get fairly huge these days in organizations. So we've still got axes somewhere. Well, containers, they're just the head, aren't they? That's just the application. It's just the workload. Or, well, maybe containers are more like arrows. They're much more lightweight. But ultimately, something's there to orchestrate the container. It needs to run somewhere. So are they necessarily the right answer? Microservices. Well, I thought about this initially in terms of throwing stars. But the whole point about a microservice is it's very, very reusable. Throwing stars, well, I may have to go around and pick them out the wall afterwards or wherever they happen to end up. Maybe they should be boomerangs. I think that's a better concept when we talk about microservices. I throw it out, I use it, and it comes back, and I can use it again. I can use it multiple times. So everyone, like the cool kids, go, oh, it's all about microservices today. We don't want to do containers anymore. Right? But again, it needs somewhere to run. And they go, well, I don't care. I'm going to use Lambda. I'm going to use this thing. I'm going to run my microservices in the cloud. Well, you're still running on a big axe somewhere. Let's be honest. Or we just simply redesign the axe. We come up with a much more efficient approach to the axe. How do we do this? And I'm asking you as the attendees, think about this. Is there a better approach? How do we change the way we use and consume IT? And sometimes when I have this discussion, colleagues and friends go, it's all right. The cloud will save us. We'll just run everything in the cloud. You were all in the keynote this morning. Are the cloud providers our friends? Discuss, right. But ultimately, the cloud acts as a service. You're just consuming these things on their platform. You're tying yourselves to their axe. And it's very hard sometimes to disassociate yourself from that axe to move to a different one. So might not necessarily be the right answer, but there are many things today for organizations where consuming it as a service may make sense. And also the kind of axe they're operating in the cloud, well, it's not just a big fat axe. They've got a properly scaled out hardware platform with resiliency. So they've thought differently about what the axe should look like. And it still amazes me when we go into enterprise organizations and they still think in terms of scale up rather than scale out, because some of these big platforms are still designed around scale up, not scale out. So really, what are our options? Do we have options? Well, we can go for everything as a service. You know, we can go and email. Many of us consume email as a service. One of my friends is presenting about email next door. If you don't want to consume it as a service, you want to run it yourself, go watch the video later. Things like payroll and accounting are really popular to run in the cloud. Kind of HR platforms, inventory management. Everybody wants to sell you this thing as a service today. But there's issues around that, around data ownership and data sovereignty. Even here in Australia, I know organizations who won't run certain types of data sets on foreign-owned cloud providers. And when we look at this more broadly across the Asia-Pacific region, the need for keeping data in country is incredibly important, not exposing it to US or overseas-owned organizations. Also, it's not appropriate for every kind of workload. Sometimes you've got to be very, very close to the environment you're working with or managing, particularly in areas like manufacturing. But I know the cloud providers are looking at that a lot more closely. They're coming up with options to stretch their cloud into your on-premises environment, be as close as possible to you. And, well, we know all about this. Look at the impact recently on some of the big open source licensing changes, the way that the cloud providers have reused a number of major open source platforms and kind of resold them as a service to their customers without fully supporting those ecosystems. That's a huge concern, particularly for us in the room. We want to have an open and viable ecosystem, a vibrant one. So there's a few concerns there. We also have to realize that reuse should have a good defined end of life. In fact, everything we do in IT should have a well-defined end of life. Are we still getting vendor supplied security updates? Do we have open alternatives when those operating systems or other things hit their end of life? I remember when I first started using Lineage over 10 years ago, there was a huge range of phones you could put it on. Today, it's quite a smaller footprint. What do you put on an old laptop when you pass it down to your family? Should you look at something like Linux, or maybe you look at something like Chrome OS Flex, which is actually, again, it's owned by one of the big cloud providers, one of the big IT companies, but it makes things simpler for that family member, that end user. But there are secondary concerns around that, but there are also some good things happening. We're starting to see hardware that will last a lot longer. We're not necessarily stuck in this 3-year hardware refresh cycle. 5, 6 or more years for a laptop or a piece of hardware is not uncommon now. I'm really pleased to see the work Google has done around the Android and Chrome ecosystems and trying to extend the life around software updates. Like my day-to-day tablet is actually a Galaxy Tab S3, which is way out of its support life from Samsung, which is really frustrating. But there's nothing wrong with it. In fact, I can go in any decent hardware supplier today, and half a dozen of the tablets in there will be less powerful than my 6-7-year-old tablet. It still does what I need to do. I just can't patch it, can't fix it. There isn't a reasonable alternative for it. And where are we going around things like open hardware platforms and the open ICEs, things like RISC-V and Power? Are we going to, through them, see new innovation that's going to give us platforms that will last a bit longer, be supported a bit better? Or are we going to be stuck in the same cycle of trying to manage support? But for IT, and sometimes even at home, can we abstract ourselves away from the underlying platform? I did a talk again at a previous Linux Conf AU around, building ephemeral workloads, treating everything as ephemeral. It's becoming a big thing. There's a shift towards, operating system environments or virtual instances where they're easily recreatable. We're treating everything as code. This is great. I've recently been through an exercise where I'd defined the deployment of a set of workloads for a CentOS/RHEL 7 footprint. It took three lines of Ansible needed changing for that to work on the latest builds of Fedora and the latest builds of Red Hat Enterprise Linux 9 and the latest builds of Ubuntu and other platforms. Basically, I had a repeatable pattern. I wasn't tied to the underlying operating system. I could deploy that regardless of whether it was on x86 or ARM. In the future, I could deploy that regardless of whether it was on an open ISO like OpenPower or RISC-V. I'd abstracted myself away from the underlying infrastructure. Some organizations do that. In fact, I've talked to people here this week who help organizations abstract themselves away from being tied to a particular cloud. Once we have that portability, we have freedom to innovate in other ways. Importantly, making sure we scale out, not up. I love seeing a customer define their architecture and look at this amazing platform they're about to release, and then going through and identifying every single point of failure. Multiple single points of failure, multiple cases where a part of that environment can't scale. There's only one copy of it. And this is a common pattern we still see in organizations. We've got to try and avoid it. Because ultimately it's focusing on the service for the customer, not the infrastructure or the platform it's running on. If the biggest concern you've got about the hardware you're operating is how quickly your vendor can ship you a new hard drive if there's a failure, then you're designing the platform wrong. How many of you have seen Die Hard? I love the scene where he pulls out the chainsaw and goes through the cables in Die Hard. I really want to go into a data center one day and do that to a rack, right? If you can do that to your infrastructure and the service still operates, then it's resilient, then it's robust. We need to think about resilient and robust systems. And the great thing is a lot of these are being built around open tools and open approaches. And it's great to see this. All the innovation in CI/CD and pipeline development are using open tooling. All the cool kids are now learning how to do this using open tooling. That to me is inspiring. This is awesome. Let's give them the open platforms for them to do it on. And when you're talking or working with an organization or within your own organization, a crucial part of this, and it's something that I talk to a lot of organizations about, is your SOE or your standard operating environment. I've walked into a company and said, "What's your SOE?" And he goes, "It's Linux." Awesome. And then they stop. Or, "Yeah, we're using this," and then they stop, right? An SOE is more than just defining my operating system. It's crucial to define your base operating system, your base containers, wherever you're going to be, you're running your code on top of. Identity and role-based access are also a crucial part of this. If you have a chance, catch Fraser Tweedale, and I think there's another session here on identity this week. Security and compliance. Security can't be an afterthought. Bake that into everything you do. If you're going to do identity, you need to understand the security concerns. Make sure you bake in the right security profiles, again, for your identity and role-based access. Your business will be concerned about how it manages risk. For some organizations, they've loved these big, long-lived, big Dwarf Axe systems because for them, the biggest risk is taking the system down for patching. The biggest risk is the lack of availability because they're taking a system approach, not a service approach. Let's look at the risk to the organization, not just for around the business service, the workload, and everything else you're doing. And then bake in life cycle management. Life cycle of the hardware, life cycle of the software, life cycle of the operating system, of everything you do. Bake in that patch management approach. And we should be doing this with our own stuff. And we also want to be avoiding doing it on behalf of the rest of the family, because being the IT person for your entire family is never necessarily a lot of fun. So the question is it time to say goodbye to the Dwarf Axe? Can we finally walk away from it? Well, maybe we're looking at access on demand now. Go back to that ephemeral idea. I can provision and build the workload as and when I need it. I can scale up as and when I need it. Maybe my Dwarf Axes are just there when I need them. Maybe AI is just going to solve it all for me. That benevolent AI that's coming along. So Dwarf Axes will be with us for a long time. They're not going anywhere. They come in many sizes and shapes. So please stop trying to create new ones, right? They're not necessarily a good idea. And the cloud is just someone else's axe. So the closing questions for my audience are, how many Dwarf Axes do you have? Come on, admit it. Do you have a Dwarf Axe in your house? Have you built a Dwarf Axe, or are you going to keep building them? Please stop building them. And how long do we need to keep maintaining these Dwarf Axes? Because ultimately, there's going to be another Dwarf Axe, no matter what we do for the foreseeable future. And if you disagree vehemently with my talk, I'm here all week. Come buy me a beer. Questions? Thoughts? Paul was up first, and then...
So who was up first?
Paul first.
Oh.
I was going to ask a really specific question about the Galaxy Tab S3, but you've answered that. So I was going to ask, I feel like there's a bit of a contradiction in your use of the Dwarf Axe here, because you're talking about both a server that you maintained, which you upgraded and is still working, which is great. And then you're talking about systems which are kind of designed to be these big, menacing things which are too big to fail. And it always strikes me that the thing that drives the too big to fail mentality is aversion to risk. And you kind of touched on risk there. Is that something that you see is being integral to this?
Yeah, it is. It really is. I mean, if I step back to kind of this era of iterating on this platform, I really should have walked away. I should have realized you're now just doing it for the sake of it. I'm treating my Dwarf Axe like it is a pet. I just can't walk away from it. And IT corporates get like this as well. They keep feeding the machine, and then if you're not careful, you end up building this team around it that's their mentality. They can never walk away. They can never let it go. I've seen organizations where an IT project where they're going to completely step away from a legacy platform and innovate gets derailed because of that one or two individuals that are so locked into the legacy platform. Some of the first big Linux projects I ever did, we spent a huge amount of our time just trying to build walls around the Unix and mid-range teams who were trying to pull everything back into their ecosystem. And I kept thinking, well, we've kind of won. We keep thinking we've won. And yet I can still walk into organizations in many countries in Asia today, and I still see the same thing happening. We've got this big fat system. We love it. We care about it. We're going to keep maintaining this Dwarf Axe. We can't even think about an alternative. And in fact, I've gone through it. I've actually replaced an axe recently, and it was like therapeutic. Because I had another axe. I had another Dwarf Axe, another system that's been with me a long, long time. And I finally managed to step away from it. And it's actually quite therapeutic to know I could do that. And I'm trying to build mechanisms where I can do that. Trying to get an organization to make that flip of maintain, manage, cuddle, curate forever to we can just go somewhere new is really hard. Which is why we go on about being cloud native and everything's going containers. And you want an organization, most of the workloads still run in virtual machines. Most of the workloads are big fat workloads. Most of the workloads are running off-the-shelf proprietary software. They're still stuck. So how do we help them change?